we're live.
Fantastic, everyone, and hugely appreciate you joining our International Book Club. And as you're all aware, today we are reviewing the amazing Cecily, with probably the best cover of all times for a history book, with the writer of Cecily, Annie Garthwaite. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here and
Well,
to be talking about Cecily.
Annie is doing the circuit right now, talking with all of the great and the good. So we're jolly privileged to have her join us. And I want to just share a little bit about Annie, because I think it's very relevant to the book. As always, pop your questions in the chat. We'll do our very, very best to answer them. And because people join at different times, Annie, I may sometimes remind people what LinkedIn Live they're on. So Annie grew up in the northeast of England. She studied English at the University of Wales before an extraordinary career in business spanning 30 years. And in 2017, she returned to her first big love, and that's books, and set out to write the story of a woman that she'd always felt drawn to. Cecily Neville. And this became her debut novel, Neville a novel, her debut novel. And it's set for me at an incredible time. Most of you know I was a medieval historian by my primary degree, and it's set right in the middle, the vortex of unrest, political power play that was the extraordinary time of 15th century England. And the book reimagines the life of Cecily, who was the Duchess of York. She was a mother, wife, a really shrewd political player in one of the most brutal and actually treacherous times of medieval England, the War of the Roses. This book is already an indie fiction bestseller. It is a Times and Sunday Times top pick and a Waterstones best book of 2021, which as a debut novel, that is kind of powering it through. So Annie, thank you again for joining us on our International Book Club. We have people already from all over the world. And let's start a little bit, if we may, with you. So your sort of the big chunk of your life has so far been in business, and then you turned to writing. And having a business career myself, I assume that you've encountered a degree of male-centric environments, maybe even a little misogyny along the way.
Oh yeah, just a few.
Did you, and a number of strong women I know have asked this, did you write Cecily as a sort of cathartic move to tell the story of a powerful woman in a man's world? Did you see yourself in any part of the wondrous Cecily?
That's such a good question to start with, and it goes right to the heart of the thing for me. I mean, my interest in Cecily actually predates that. Yeah. I first got interested in Cecily and her period when I was in school, in my teens. And it's quite funny, actually. It was Wars of the Roses on the history syllabus. I was a young student of 15, and I was just fascinated and agog. And I was just lucky enough to have one of those teachers who really engages you, and he just, at the time when most history teachers were just forcing dates down people's throats, he was teaching history like it was happening now, and I was just fascinated. And he just kept lobbing. I don't think he'd actually had a student interested in his subject before. So he'd sort of latched onto me like a limpet, and he just kept throwing books across the desk at me. And sometimes textbooks, sometimes biographies, sometimes novels. And I read a novel about Richard III, Cecily's son, and I became, first of all, intrigued by him. But as I got as I grew older, as the years passed, I became more and more fascinated and drawn to the women around Richard, because there were just such strong women in that period. And by the time I finished university, my idea was set to write this novel about Cecily. And I thought, when I was thinking of my career, I thought, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a job in publishing and write alongside. And I thought that would be a marvelous way to live, the career complementing the art and vice versa. And I did get a job in publishing. I got a great job, but I don't know whether it's the same today, but in the 80s, publishing paid shamefully small salaries. And I was working full time and working in pubs at night and bars in the evening, to pay rent. So I sort of did a deal with the devil because there was no time to write. So I did a bit of a deal with the devil, and I said, well, I will go into business proper. I will earn a living and have a business career. But at 55, whatever the day job is, I will give it up and I will write this book. And that was a sort of 30-year life plan, really. But it was a painful decision to make then. But I'm really glad that I made it, because in that business, those 30 years of being in business, Cecily got closer and closer and closer. And particularly when I was in my 30s, by which time I was working for a big American multinational, I can remember barely any women at my level of management in Europe, in the European operation. And I was frequently the only woman at the big table. And I just found myself thinking, here am I learning all of the techniques that Cecily learned 500 years ago about how to get things done when men hold all the power cards. When people aren't giving you power and you just have to assume it somehow.
Yeah.
So it was painful at the time, but I'm really glad that I waited.
You made it.
Yeah, it was a great decision.
That's fantastic. For those of you who've just joined, we have our International Book Club and the amazing Annie Garthwaite talking about her best-selling novel, Cecily. Now, one of the things that, being a medieval historian myself, is not that glamorous or exciting about the medieval period, is the sort of the smell, the goriness of life, how tough it was. And I thought you did a pretty good job of capturing that reality, particularly a couple of the birthing pages. We had a new birth within our family, and, very, very challenging, but nothing compared to a 15th century birth with no medication, with no epidurals, with nothing. How did you, unfortunately, the data or the information, because it was all written by men, mostly in the 15th century, isn't very rich in this area. How did you do such a good job of keeping the medieval smells and sounds and birthings so real?
Yeah, I think that sort of female experience is really hard to get a grasp on for the Middle Ages, because, as you say, it wasn't written about. And particularly when it came to childbirth, childbirth was a uniquely female space. And the way it worked, it's odd too, because I am myself not a mother. I've never gone through that experience myself. And I really wanted to do justice to it, because it's such a big part of Cecily's life. She bears 12 children for Richard. So I found myself calling all my girlfriends who had had children and saying, right, all that stuff I told you never to tell me about, I need you to tell me now. And I found myself thinking, oh my God, I don't know how anybody ever has 2 children.
Yeah.
You might go through that once, but twice, really,
Yeah.
But then also getting very interested in the sort of bizarre way that a medieval aristocratic woman managed childbirth. The way it worked was about a month before you thought your child was born, you went into seclusion, and that meant a closed room, curtained, fire burning in the hearth all of the time in case the devil came down the chimney to eat your unborn child's soul. You saw no men, not even your husband. You were waited on by women, and only by women who themselves had had children. Before you went into that room, you were shriven, prepared for your anticipated death, because it was frequent that women died in childbirth. You would wait for that time. Your child would be born. Hopefully it would live. Hopefully you would live. It would be taken from you and baptized, brought back, given to a wet nurse. You wouldn't nurse it, because your job was to get your body back in shape and go and get the next one.
Imagine that 12 times. I mean,
12 times. And I can remember saying to my girlfriends, you know, that this is such a bizarre way of going on, locking people up like this, locking women into seclusion like this. It's terrible. And they all looked a bit wistful and said, oh, no, actually, it would be lovely.
Oh, marvelous. Now, your passion for Cecily and the part she's played in your life, you've shared a little with us. And there's sort of two questions that have come through, both of which I think are sensational. The first is, so imagine you were able to go back and meet Cecily, or she was able to come forward and meet you. What is the question that was not answered in your research? What is the thing, the issue that you'd like, to raise with her? And then equally, what would you tell the mighty Cecily she had most taught you, and anyone who chooses to read the book and learn about the life of Cecily Neville, what it would teach us? I have my thoughts, but yours are much more important.
Well, the mystery about Cecily that I would ask her about, I suppose, but in a way, I love the mystery so much, I almost don't want it to be solved. And this is something that happened, it was discovered after her death. She was buried in Fotheringay next to her husband. She lived to 80. She was phenomenally long-lived. And during the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, her tomb was disturbed and broken down. And when Elizabeth I visited the church, who of course is her great-granddaughter, she was so appalled by the state of the tomb that she paid to have it repaired and reinstated. And when Cecily's body was removed to be reinterred, it was found that around her neck, tied on a red cord, was a papal pardon. And to me, that says that she clearly thought that when she stood before God in judgment, she was going to need a really good get out of jail free card.
The politician till the end.
To the end. She was going to need to stand there and say, I've got this, I've done these terrible things, but I've got this. And I'm intrigued to know, what is it that she thought she had done that was so terrible that it could damn her for all eternity? I mean, it just makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So that's, I think if I were to ask her a question, I would say, what do you think you need to be forgiven for?
Brilliant. And what would you tell her while she told you the truth about, I mean, there's enough in the book and enough we do know that might want you to have that get out of jail card, ready. So if there's something even more, but what would you tell her she had done to inspire you and thus a generation of female historians and people who've read your book? Not just women, but many men have found this book extraordinary as well.
Well, the great thing, there seems to be a trend right now for women novelists like myself, recovering lost women's voices from history. We see it in Pat Barker and so on and so forth. And clearly we perceive a need to look back into the past and say, look, all this time there have been powerful, self-determined, autonomous women who have exercised power. And the men have tried to sweep that under the carpet, but they've always been there. Let's just take a look at them. And there was a woman who lived directly contemporaneously with Cecily. And that was a French woman called Christine de Pizan.
Mm-hmm.
And she was that very rare thing in the 15th century. She was a female scholar who made her living by her scholarship and her writing. Very rare, you can imagine.
Mm.
And she wrote a book called The City of Ladies. And in it, she looked back to her history. So I guess from the 15th century, she's looking back to classical times. And she is peopling an imaginary city with powerful women from the past and recovering their voices and their stories. She's doing exactly what we're doing now.
Yeah.
And while part of me thinks it's marvelous to be part of such a proud tradition, another part of me thinks it's shameful that we still have to do that. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. And
So
what do you would you tell her? How would you relate that to Cecily? What would you have asked her to sort of do differently, knowing, as you say, that the repeat of this Lost Voices has gone on another, 692 years?
Mm. Well, the great thing about Cecily is whilst she put all of her energies into promoting the careers of her husband and her sons, the descendants who have perhaps achieved most and of whom I feel she would have been proudest
Were daughters.
were her daughters. Exactly. Yeah. You know, if you look at Margaret, who became Duchess of Burgundy,
Yep.
you look at her, her ancestors, Elizabeth I.
Yep.
I would be saying to her, well done, Cecily, because you did create a woman who ruled England. And I think that would be amazing to her. It would be something she would never have expected in her lifetime.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And then studying, this was one of my questions, but I'm delighted that a couple of other people have raised it too. With your career in business, often being the only woman at the table, or and then studying Cecily with such precision. What I saw a quote by a Hollywood actress today whose whose new film is launching. I'm sure the Brontes will be thrilled, but she talks about strong-willed women, and I wondered what advice you would give to strong-willed women who are not necessarily the one advantage Cecily had is that she was noble born and not eating every day grass in the gutter, but in a more equal society today, though not equal even on this call. What advice, what learnings from your career and from the mighty Cecily would you pass on? A couple of people have said, Cecily seems so hard. I can't empathize with her. She seems pretty assertive. I all of these things have been said of me as I've run businesses around the world. So maybe that's what you need. But nevertheless, I don't want to put words in your mouth. What advice would you give to strong-willed women about how they go and achieve all of their amazing goals at a time when the world is bereft of leadership as we face new realities and need some new approaches? How would you make your learnings and those of Cecily relevant to us?
I would say I'm never too worried when people say to me, "Oh, Cecily's a bit of a hard character, isn't she? She's a bit of a hard nut. Don't entirely like her." I always think that's completely fine, because I think the biggest mistake that women make is to listen to the voices that have told us to always be amenable, to always make ourselves liked, to acquiesce, to keep the peace. And I think when women do that in business, it's a disaster, because they end up being put upon, assumed, and never making their way forward. So my advice always when I'm speaking to young women is don't worry too much about being liked.
Yeah.
Worry about being good at what you do. And that doesn't mean be a bitch. It doesn't mean be horrible. It still means be kind and be gracious. But don't fret too much about always being liked.
Absolutely. For those just joining, we're on our international book club with the amazing Annie Garthwaite talking about her sensational novel, Cecily, just giving us advice, us strong-willed women, what she has learned in business as a writer and from Cecily. I would only add to that, Annie, about, being who you are, that our unique differences make us special. And we should be involved in things where you are surrounded by people that encourage you to bring 100% of yourself to work, 200% if you can. Now, we've had some questions about historical accuracy. I have a big followership amongst the data scientist brigade. And so there's a question mark. Now, I've read a lot about this on, an in parallel historical tome from a professional historian and how much that helped you. But how did you ensure that despite it being a novel, or because it is a novel, you never betrayed historical research and accuracy? How hard was that? How did you do that, Annie?
It is hard, but I do worry about historical fictions that play fast and loose with the truth, with historical fact. And we see that particularly in Hollywood all the time, don't we? There was a recent TV series in the UK about the Tudors, and it was just, it became ludicrous, Henry VIII had sisters he'd never had, and they married people, all that sort of thing. And it's a bit like Star Trek, don't mess with the timeline.
Yes,
change the past, change the future. Yeah. So I was very concerned. The rule I made for myself is that if we know that something happened in such and such a way at such and such a time, I will not pretend that it didn't. I won't lie. But thankfully, there's enough about, and I'm sure you'll know, having studied the Wars of the Roses, there's enough about this period that either genuinely isn't known or where the evidence is really conflicting and where historians are still knocking seven bells out of each other, arguing about it.
Yes.
But there's still lots and lots and lots of room for the novelist to play, to
absolutely. Yeah.
And I'll give you a really good example of that. There is a historical train of thought, and it was a rumor at the time of Cecily's, in her own lifetime, that Edward, who became Edward IV, was not her husband's son. She had had an affair with an archer in France. And as a novelist, part of me really wanted that to be true, because what a plot twist, right? That would be fascinating to write. So I went into this in a way trying to prove to myself that it was a true rumor. But first of all, it was when that rumor first emerges in her lifetime, it's being put about by the Earl of Warwick and the King of France, who are eager to rebel against Edward IV. So not a trustworthy source. And then more recent historians who've revived the rumor have relied on some very questionable dating. Edward was born in April. They've counted back exactly 9 months and said, well, here's a 10-day window in which Edward must have been conceived. Well, that's obviously a man's idea, isn't it? Because you and I know that pregnancies are longer or shorter. And Richard, Duke of York, was not in Rouen with Cecily during those 10 days. Therefore, he's somebody else's son. Well, it's nonsense. That 10 days is a very sort of unstable presumption. And also, when you look at it, in fact, when I looked at it in detail, Richard almost certainly was in Rouen during that crucial period anyway, because although he had a military operation going on upriver in Pontoise, he'd left someone else in charge of that, and he'd come back to Rouen to manage supply lines and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, I rigorously investigated the truth about that.
In the hope, yeah.
Yeah. But it was,
Absolutely. And
didn't
sometimes
do
there's an amazing intervention. I remember when I was at university studying the economic data about the rule of King John and how so many of his actions were driven by rampant inflation and what, had cost X before and after him was just, out of control. And so these historical nuances, but there's a couple of things that have come in, Annie, from our viewers. One is a telling off for me. Why do you say strong-willed for women? Would you say that about men? I think most of you who know me know exactly how I describe assertive, direct, aggressive men. And you're quite right. We're focused on strong-willed women because we have Annie Garthwaite, Harriet Green, and Cecily Neville that we're talking about. So hardly a peek in for men on this one. But I do agree with you. I had a recent situation in another environment, a bookie environment, where a very opinionated, direct individual, male, when I am opinionated and direct, I'm aggressive. So you're right. It is the language that needs to change. And then there's a lot of interest. Annie, you and I were talking before we went live. Are you the amazing writer of the book, Annie, Cecily, or are you a writer? And there's a lot of interest in, is there two lines of thought? Is there another historical figure that you're sort of in love with and want to write about? You don't have to be in love with them, but are going to write about. And then a lot of interest in who are your current sort of favorite rock star authors, and are they inspiring you in a genre? We had Hervé Letellier last time, and just inspired a whole new genre of book writing. But people want to know what's next, and they want to know what inspires you, Annie.
Well, next is a book that is halfway written at the moment and needs to be finished by the end of this year, which is in some ways a return to, well, it is absolutely a return to Cecily's world, because this book takes us to 1461 when Edward IV comes to the throne. But Cecily lives forever. She lives on until 1495, and some of the real dramas of her life are still to come.
Yeah.
And in the next book, I'll be writing about the really critical end games in the Wars of the Roses, and reframing that war. When people talk about the Wars of the Roses, they say it's a war between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, or it's a dynastic struggle, and it is, of course, or it's a war between two families, the Nevilles and the Beauforts, which it is, of course. But I'm going to reframe it as the War of the Women. Because the 1470s and 80s are dominated by 4 women who go to any length possible to get the ultimate power, to become the king's mother and put their sons on the throne.
Yes.
Cecily, Margaret of Anjou, Margaret Beaufort, and Elizabeth Woodville.
Yeah.
And in pursuit of that goal, all 4 of them do unspeakable things. But fight with such courage and determination. And what I hope to show in the next book is that the women were not just observers of the conflict, and they certainly weren't, well, they weren't only the victims of it, they were active participants in the conflict. They were the drivers of the conflict in many ways. And I don't think we've looked at the Wars of the Roses in that way before.
Now, did you not, as with other great historical writers, then you didn't say Cecily Part 1, even though there's clearly a Part 2. Was that in case Part 1 was not the rip-roaring success it is, or?
Well, I wanted people to pick up Cecily and read it and feel, even if they never read anything else ever by Annie Garthwaite again, to feel it had a completely satisfying reading experience. It's a complete story, and it is very Cecily focused.
It is. It's beautifully contained, bookended. Your rock star inspirers at this time? Is there are a couple of authors you throw into the pot that have grabbed your attention? Then I've got two brilliant questions. I wish I'd thought of them, but they're not mine, that I want to get that's come in from the audience. But rock star writers current for you during lockdown?
I'll name three. One which won't surprise you at all, and that's Hilary Mantel.
Yeah, of course.
And I think there's no question in my mind, she is the absolute goddess before whose throne we should all bow down and worship when it comes to historical fiction. And Walpole is a work of complete genius. Yes. So that's her. The other writer I've been reading a lot recently and really enjoying, and it's a man, and that's Sebastian Barry. Mm-hmm. And I would recommend anyone to read his fabulous book, Days Without End, which is set in the United States during the Indian Wars and the Civil War. It's just Wars of Independence. It's a stunning book and a glorious gay love story. It's just beautiful. And the other one, I'll give you a heads up on one that's coming down the pike. Yeah. And it's publishing in July. And I know it's coming out simultaneously in the US and the UK. I don't know about elsewhere in the world. And it's about Joan of Arc. Mm-hmm. And it's just called Joan. It's by Catherine Chen. Mm-hmm. And I was sent a proof copy to read by her publisher. And I read it in 2 days. I could not put it down. And I thought, I wish I'd written that.
Wow. Well, to Catherine and to Sebastian, the fact that Annie Garthwaite is recommending your work, that and of course Hilary Mantel, as you say, we all bow. That is so gracious and humble of you to answer in that way. So the two questions that have just come in are, I think this is really interesting. How do you feel about using such modern English for this historical account? Did you fear anachronisms or misinterpretation? And now yours is not a historical research piece, but we certainly encountered that at uni. But I thought a great question. What do you think?
Yeah, it is great, isn't it? The question of voice is so vexed, I think, when you're writing anything set in the Middle Ages, because you cannot write in the common vernacular because that's Middle English or French and no one would understand it. So that's clearly out of the question. And if you try to create anything that sounds like medieval speech, then it becomes these and thous and flowery, and
it's hard to read.
Pastiche, doesn't it? Yeah. It can't be taken seriously. So I decided to use a very modern vernacular tone of voice for the action. But I did work very hard to try and avoid anachronisms. I remember once reading a historical fiction set in the 15th century where the word okay was used.
Sort of lost you.
It immediately pulls you out of the present in the book, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I spent an awful lot of time with my thesaurus right beside me, tracing back the origins of words or of turns of phrase or sayings, and saying, would they be current language at that time? And I remember having a big discussion with my editor when we got to final edits on the book, and she said, would people say fuck in the 15th century?
They would.
Oh, yes, they absolutely would.
They definitely would.
And I can give you written evidence of that.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, that is great. And then I think a really super question as we sort of round out. We haven't had, if any of you have any other questions, we reached the half an hour, and that always seems to be on the LinkedIn Lives a point of lots of wow comments, loving you, your humility, your grace, and your great writing. Of course, you can take one book on your desert island as you're interviewed for Desert Island Discs. What is it, Annie? What are you going to take on that desert island? You can't really take Cecily because you know every single word in every single order, and that wouldn't really serve its purpose.
No.
What would you take?
Well, by virtue of it being good and big and chunky, if not for any other reason, I would take the Wolf Hall trilogy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Because
Yes.
every time I read it,
You learn
and I
something
read
new.
it,
Yeah.
you notice something that you haven't noticed before. And
Fantastic.
it's just packed full of sentences that take your breath away. You know, it's beautiful as a book, as a complete work, but it's beautiful at sentence level.
Yeah.
You know,
Incredible.
Yeah.
So, for those of you who've joined us, all those amazing questions from around the world, thank you. We're privileged to have the lovely Annie Garthwaite talk about an amazing book. For those of you who've not read it, not that Annie needs our book sales, she's already established herself with a debut.
I do.
So those of you who haven't yet bought a copy, please go out and buy one. But it's a rip-roaring read. It empowers you, whether you're a strong-willed individual, male or female, but certainly speaks to us women who've been called aggressive on way too many occasions. Not you, Annie. You sound that you have that balance perfectly right. So thank you for your own comments, your lovely book recommendations, which I haven't read the Joan book, but I often say this to people in business around the world. This is a Joan moment. Obviously, I want it to end better than it did for Joan, as that was a pretty terrifying ending. But I'm excited about that, and Days Without End. Days Without End. Yeah.
Yes. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful.
Oh, I'm excited to read that. So a big, big thank you, Annie. You've been amazing and lovely. Enrich the book still further. Have an amazing Pride Month. I know you're doing a great deal as well as supporting the book. We have a big LinkedIn Live on Thursday with some amazing panelists talking about unique differences and celebrating those across the broadest church. So hopefully people will join us for that too. But to Annie Garthwaite, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for being on our LinkedIn Live.
Oh, and thank you for reading it. It's the greatest gift you can give a writer.
Take good care. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.